Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for braving the cold to come out here to learn a little bit more about one of the gems in the opera literature canon, and that is Gaetano Donizetti's L'Elixir d'Amore. And I have three very special guests here tonight who are going to help me talk about this wonderful piece, and they are Andy Wilkowski, Nicole Cabell, and Leonardo Capalbo. Have all had very busy days rehearsing, but have agreed to be here tonight to help out. Give them a big round of applause, please. So here I am again, talking about one of the most popular pieces in the literature. We do this a lot in opera. We perform these pieces over and over again. Why do we do that with the standard repertoire? Well, like most great art, we do it because it tells us really important things, not just about ourselves as human beings, but about history and culture. Now, The Elixir of Love was for 10 years, between 1838 and 1848, it was the most performed opera in the entire world. And it's never gone out of the canon. So it was premiered in 1832, and it really is an absolute gem, totally polished. It's balanced in every way, but most importantly, it stands at a particularly interesting time in musical culture and in the development of Western classical music. It stands between the classical and the Romantic eras. It represents the bel canto tradition. It has roots in commedia dell'arte. It's an absolutely wonderful work that's brimming with tunes we all know and love. So the easiest thing for me to do tonight would be to ask the soloists to stand up and sing some of those popular arias. I could present Prendi for the soprano, Prendi per me sei libero. I could present Belcore's aria, Come parire vezzoso, one of the most popular baritone arias. And of course, I could do Una furtiva lagrima, which is one of the most popular tenor arias ever written. It's on every tenor's CD. It's been performed countless thousands of times, not just in the show, but in concert halls. And I think, these pieces become devoid of their theatrical trappings, and sometimes we have absolutely no idea what they're really about. So a lot of people in Una furtiva lagrima think when he sings Mama, si mama, that he's actually talking to his mother. Mama. He's not. He's saying she loves me at that point. It's nothing to do with maternal affection, this particular piece. And it's the same thing with standard works, They're so well known and beloved, we forget just what fine examples of culture and history and humanity they actually are. So if you read up about the Elixir of Love, you're probably going to encounter some sort of sentence, I made this one up, that reads, "The Elixir of Love is one of the finest examples of opera buffa, an early romantic work in the bel canto style based on a 200-year-old theatrical tradition with its roots in commedia dell'arte." Well, that makes perfect sense. It's very erudite, quite academic, and we sort of know what all of those words mean. But do we really know what those words mean? Do we really know what early romantic means, or bel canto, or opera buffa, especially commedia dell'arte? Well, I want to talk a bit about those, because they're very important terms, and they appear throughout opera. So I think the easiest one to dispatch is the first, opera buffa. I think we know that means it's not an opera seria. The easiest thing to decide is that it's Italian, opera buffa. We know it's Italian. And it's not opera seria, which would be a more serious work, probably tragic, maybe based in mythology. Mozart wrote similar examples, like Idomeneo, La Clemenza di Tito. It's a funny opera, an opera buffa, like The Barber of Seville, or The Marriage of Figaro. And there were other operas like Dramma Giocoso, like Don Giovanni, that sit right between. It can have elements of both. But it's not just that it's a funny opera instead of a serious opera. We know it's an Italian funny opera. Because in France at this time, a different thing was going on. We had grand opera instead of opera seria. And grand opera was a ridiculous spectacle, with a full ballet and 5 acts and hundreds of performers and big orchestras and stage machinery and intermissions and extra orchestral interludes. And the opposite to that was not an opera buffa, it was an opera comique. But the difference about the French one was it was like a German Singspiel. It was set musical numbers interspersed with spoken dialogue, which is what Carmen is. Carmen was premiered at the Opera Comique. It's anything but a funny opera. It's one of the most tragic. But it is set musical numbers interspersed with spoken dialogue. And that's how we'll actually perform it when we do it at the end of the season. Now, an opera buffa, an Italian one, has no spoken word. It's all sung. And that's the beauty of Italian bel canto works. It's, of course, in the singing. So there we are. We know what an opera buffa is. It's an Italian comic opera from this period. Now, what's an early romantic piece? And we get sort of, that's far too big a topic for me to sort of deal with comfortably in about 50 minutes. But you can find traces of the beginning, the very burgeoning beginning of Romanticism throughout this wonderful work. And that's one of the most delightful things. So, before Romanticism, there was Classicism, or Neoclassicism, as it's called architecturally. You can think the Palace of Versailles, you know? And it stems from the Enlightenment. It stems from the scientific and the industrial revolutions. People have telescopes, people have microscopes, and they start taking everything apart and studying it in a very rational way. And this was wonderful. It led to great events in the history of mankind, like the French Revolution, you know, destroying this huge class system, bringing us closer together as a group of people. But it could only go so far before there was a reaction against it. There's always a reaction in culture. We have the Reformation, then we have the Counter-Reformation. And it's the same with Romanticism. People stopped enjoying taking things apart, and they wanted to leave the mystery of nature. They weren't so concerned about the present and the here and the now. They wanted to get back to those wonderful myths of the medieval era. The knights and the gallant damsel in distress, the knight on shining armor, on horseback, all of that sort of magic, the supernatural. In fact, Donizetti later writes a piece, Lucia di Lammermoor, set in the Scottish Highlands with, you know, wedding dresses covered in blood and revenge and madness and stabbing and mists and ghosts. We have Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, again a supernatural, spooky tale that centered on the dangers of science. So here we have Romanticism. We're getting back to the core and to the love of nature. And that's a vital part of Romanticism. And you can find clues of Romanticism throughout the score. There's Donizetti's little motif is the chromatic appoggiatura. So as we start the piece, nice and arresting. Nothing interesting about that particularly. And it's quite classical. But then, those little bluesy chromatic notes wouldn't have happened with Mozart, at least not in this way. You know? That sort of insinuating chromaticism is the beginning of musical romanticism, at least for Donizetti. It's sort of his trademark. And Donizetti was a quintessential romantic composer. So you can think, you know, Lord Byron, you know, and Shelley and Keats and Wordsworth strolling the English Lake District, you know, waxing lyrical about mountains and brooks and trees and breezes. Well, Donizetti lived that lifestyle, you know. I mean, he was a wildly overproductive genius, like you were meant to be in those times. It was all about the individual romanticism. So he could write a 3-act opera in about 10 days. And the Elixir of Love, he finished in just 6 weeks' time. He wrote nearly 70 operas in the course of his short life. He only lived about 50 years. And of course, his life was horribly tragic. You know, he married this lovely lady in 1828, Virginia Vasily, and she bore him 3 children. All 3 children died of nasty epidemics, and she died in 1837, just a few years later, of what is meant to be cholera, but was actually probably syphilis that either he gave her or she gave him, because then he died at the age of 50 of syphilitic complications. I mean, it's a wonderful romantic lifestyle. You can't be a romantic genius unless somehow you die of syphilis. It's just a given. So there's Donizetti living the romantic lifestyle. But apart from these little musical keys that we get, we also have wonderful poetic and cultural keys to romanticism. So when we open after the overture, the first thing we hear is this. Now this is a description of the wonderful peasant landscape that we're witnessing. There's a bunch of villagers, of farm workers, who are out in the hot midday sun working the fields. And it's in the key of F major. And if you think back to famous works in F major, like the Pastoral Symphony from Messiah, or even more importantly and even more contemporary, Beethoven's great Sixth Symphony, the Pastoral Symphony, in F major again, we know we're in a pastoral key. And this, of course, is a drone. It's like a bagpipe, which would have been a peasant instrument. It tells us that we're in that sort of rustic landscape. And we're in 6/8, which is the rhythm of jigs and reels and folk music. So straight away, the poetic emphasis is on a romantic world, a world that's obsessed with nature. And indeed, these villagers tell us immediately that there's no greater pleasure than being able to sit under a tree or at the foot of a hill, sound like Wordsworth yet? Yeah? Getting out of the midday sun. So there we are, immediately in the world of romanticism. And then our camera focuses in, and it focuses in on our leading lady, Adina. And the first thing she sings is this, they ask her to read from a book. She owns the land, and they're her employees, and she's educated enough to actually be able to read. So they ask her to read this book that she's enjoying, and she does. Della crudele Isotta, il bel Tristano ardea, ne fil di speme avea, di possederla undi. So what's she telling you about? She's telling you about crudele Isotta and il bel Tristano, Tristan and Isolde. Now, they are not kings or queens of the classical ancient Greek or Roman world. These are medieval myths, Tristan and Isolde. Of course, Wagner hadn't written the most romantic of all pieces yet. This is before Tristan and Isolde from Wagner's pen. But because she's talking about Tristan and Isolde back in the medieval world, we know we're in the world of romanticism, not the world of classicism anymore. So straight away, we have 2 references that are very hip for Donizetti. He's like, here we are, I'm being romantic. Not only am I writing little bluesy chromatic notes, but I'm talking about the countryside. I'm talking about brooks and breezes and hills and trees, and I'm talking about Tristan and Isolde. You've all heard of that. You've all just read it this week. So the world of romanticism lives. And this whole work is a beautiful doorway to the world of romanticism. Now, Italian opera stems from a sort of 200-year-old tradition, so it can be a little behind the time. But the beginnings of Romanticism are evident here, and that's one of the most delightful things about it. So what's the next mysterious word that I mentioned? Well, that was bel canto. And we all have these images of what bel canto means. We know it's one of three composers, most likely. It's going to be Rossini, it's going to be Donizetti, or it's going to be Bellini. They're the big triumvirate of bel canto. And we all think it means these sort of florid, languid, long legato lines. But it's much, much more than that. And L'Elixir d'Amore is one of the finest examples of bel canto. But it's very difficult to define what bel canto is without sort of demonstrating, which I will. But I can sort of tell you what it isn't, because it started as a negative definition. It didn't appear, the term bel canto doesn't appear in their time period. It occurs towards the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, when, because of Verdi writing these heavier and more difficult roles, tenors starting to push the voice out of head voice into chest voice at the top, getting a C dal petto, so singing high Cs from the chest. Baritones start copying. We get Verdi baritones. The orchestra gets heavier still. We get the works of Strauss and Mascagni and Leoncavallo and Puccini, causing more and more sound to be produced. And actually, by the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, we get a lot of what we would now call sloppy singing. Big, wide vibratos, pouring out of sound, scooping and sliding around, just because the pictures are so hard to find in Strauss, you know? And it's difficult to get over the orchestra. Bayreuth actually started singers to try and make the text so clear that they would it was called Sprechgesang. It's sort of enunciating the words in a slightly barky fashion. It was nicknamed the Bayreuth bark. So that's what bel canto isn't, because it was at that point that people started harking back to the days of bel canto, the days of beautiful singing, when people cultivated their voices in the correct way. But what it actually is a combination of many, many different techniques that we sort of take for granted now in good singing, because people are trained very well after the bel canto revival started to put these very difficult works back into the repertory. So, bel canto. Let's start. I'm going to do a bit of singing. This is one of our first characters to appear. This is the second principal. It's Belcore, the sergeant, and this is his first very well-known aria. I won't sing for long, I promise. Come parire vezzoso porse il pomo alla più bella mia diletta villanella, io ti porgo questi fior, ma di lui più glorioso, più di lui felice io sono, poiché in premio del mio dono, poiché in premio del mio dono ne riporto il tuo bel cor. I need a coaching, but other than that, so that went remarkably well for me. No, oh, thank you. So the first thing you notice that tells you it's bel canto is a very simple pattern accompaniment. Nothing to it. I could write this. The melody is only occasionally highlighted by the instruments in the woodwinds. The harmonies are very simple. Anything out of the ordinary there. It's totally formulaic. So how does he create the character of this pompous, arrogant sergeant who thinks he's God's gift to women? Well, the answer in bel canto is that all of the theatre is in the voice part. Now, that's not the case with Wagner and with Verdi. The orchestra is given a much bigger role. But in bel canto, the theatre lives in the voice, it lives in the text, and that's very key. Yes, I sang a sort of legato line, but the next thing you might notice are the big gestures. So here, that theme there, that dotted theme, clearly tells you immediately that this man is a soldier because of reveille or... It's a bugle call. Of course it's a bugle call. But why does he sound so pompous? Why does it sound so exaggeratedly military? It's just a dotted rhythm. He should sound like a good soldier, but he sounds exaggerated. Because it's against triplets. Come parire de todo. And that exaggerates this dotted rhythm. So immediately he's not just a soldier, he's an exaggerated soldier, and he's an overblown one, an arrogant soldier. And his next gesture is romantic. It's a triplet. Porse il po' alla più bella, because he's trying to woo Adina. So in the course of two tiny little phrases, you have a huge amount of information about who this character is, just because of this simple accompaniment, these two musical gestures, all in the voice part. So gesture and prosody, you know, the articulation of the text, the accentuation, the expression. So there's some of the things in bel canto. But there are many things that apply. I sang sort of legato, but staccato singing is important as well. You know, I took some time in certain places. That's called rubato, and that was very important, going with the text as it needs to move forward or as it slows down. Now, I can't do things very well like divisions and graces, but I tried. Do, no. That sort of thing is very hard, and it takes training. That's called divisions. And you can see the range as well. Poi che in pre, the balance of registers and the evenness of tone through your chest voice and your passaggio, your break, and then your head voice. All of these things are bel canto over this simple papa accompaniment that we're used to. So now I'm going to have a little bit of an extract from the Act 1 finale, and I'm going to have our wonderful Nemorino, Leonardo Capalbo, sing for you. And this is Adina Credimi, and it's really the emotional heart of the show. And again, it's over a sort of very basic pattern accompaniment. I'll let him sing it, and then I'll show you some of the things that are in just the voice part. It's all in the voice part. So, Leonardo, if you would, this is Adina Credimi. Beautiful, yeah. Thank you. So apart from being heart-rendingly beautiful, the first thing you might notice is that he sings a bunch of quite symmetrical but short phrases that all descend. That's because what he's saying is, Adina, you can't marry this sergeant. Yeah? You've got to wait at least one more day before the elixir of love kicks in, because tomorrow things may all be different. That's what he's just said, essentially. So initially, what he's doing is desperate sighing. And the way to represent a sigh is a descending phrase, and the way to represent desperation is short, breathy phrases. So, and then he gets more desperate. Wait, he says. You can tell why I don't sing, but then the phrases start to turn around as he starts to think about hope and about the future, you know? I know why he says, da-da, tomorrow things may be different. Da-da, da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And he starts putting in divisions, melismas, because he's turning into joy. Yeah? Little grace notes and abbellimenti. And then the phrases, instead of descending, actually go the other way around, because he's so full of hope. Domani forse ne avresti pena, tenedor. When he's at the height of his emotion, of course, the register and the tone of his voice has to be at the top. And you will notice as well that he did this wonderful, the most beloved ornament of the bel canto tradition, and that was Resti al pardime. And that diminuendo on one note, one single note and one vowel, is half of what we call a messa di voce, which was one of the most prized abilities of the bel canto tradition. And it's much harder than you think to be able to start one note. It's called a placing of the voice, to crescendo on that same note, and then to diminuendo, even harder, on the other side, without the pitch or the intrinsic tone or vowel shape changing. It's very difficult, and it was one of the most prized ornaments, the messa di voce. And all of these wonderful singers over here do all of these things that I'm talking about on a second-to-second basis. This sort of accentuation of the words, this gesture, these messa di voce, this articulation of the phrase, depending on how het up or relaxed or in love or upset they may be at the time. This modulation of registers of the voice, this constant going through gear shifts. This is just good singing teaching now, but it didn't used to be. And this good singing teaching is actually what we call bel canto. And that's why people sound so good, is all of this training, you know, which started, and it was, I suppose the biggest example was the castrato. That was the king of the singers back then. Started with Handel. They had immense chests just because of the way they grew. They were ridiculously tall beings and had enormous lung power. They were meant to be able to do a sort of messa di voce that would last 20 seconds on the same note, you know? So these powers are what we take for granted, but is actually the bel canto tradition. So now I still have to introduce two more singers, I suppose. So I shall get on to the last part of that, which is really quite important, and probably the least familiar, and that's commedia dell'arte. What is that? Well, it's the basis of opera buffa, and it's everywhere in art. So at the end of Pagliacci, there's that little play within a play, and you have the sad clown. And the sad clown is Canio. It's actually Piero is the sad clown. That person is one of the Commedia dell'arte figures. And then you have Harlequin. We all know who Harlequin is. He's got a checkered costume. You've all heard of Punch and Judy. Well, that's an English thing. It's a puppet show. And Punch is that puppet character with a really long chin, which comes from the Commedia dell'arte character Pulcinella, who had a mask that had a really long chin. And he, in the course of a Punch and Judy show, would beat up a character called Scaramouche. And of course, you know Scaramouche from Scaramouche. Scaramouche, can you do the fandango, thunderbolt and lightning? I swear you need a whole college course to be able to understand all the cultural references in Bohemian Rhapsody. It's littered with them. But it's everywhere, this Commedia dell'arte. And it started in the 1500s, and it's a theatrical troupe that would travel, and it's short for Commedia dell'arte dell'improvviso. So, a comedy of the craft of improvisation. So these were not scripted, but these traveling troupes of about 10 people would perfect stock characters. So they'd have a bunch of phrases that they'd worked out. The ones that were meant to be intellectual would have smatterings of Greek and Latin they could spurt out. And they would be given a stock scenario to play, and these different characters from different social strata of the Italian countryside would then improvise a play based on this scenario. And it's the basis of most Italian opera in some way. And we should know the basis of how it works. So it starts with two lovers who are generally relatively young and very beautiful. And they did not wear masks. They might wear beauty spots and a lot of makeup, but not masks. And they were called the innamorati. And they had to get together at the end of the show. And they are, of course, Nemorino and Adina. And they're from different social levels, but that could happen for the innamorati. And generally, in a comedy, the next most important character is one of the vecchi, the old guys. And the old guy who always started the show was called the pantalone. And the pantalone was a miserly, very wealthy, old, bedraggled gentleman who was going to try and stop these two lovers getting together. And delightfully in this show, at the beginning of Act 2, in the wedding celebrations, Dulcamara says, I know, let's have a song, let's have a bit of a show. And he stands up and says, barcaruola due voci. We'll have a barcarolle for two voices, and they act out a commedia dell'arte. So the story is Nina Gondoliera, the gondola girl Nina, and she's one of the lovers, the innamorati, basically Colombina, and she is being wooed by Mr. Senator Three Teeth, who's much older, bit of a hunchback. He's got 3 teeth, Senator Tridenti, and he's trying to woo her. And this is the game, and because they know Commedia dell'arte, everyone did back then, it makes perfect sense. And there are wonderful gestures that Andy will probably do. He'll probably hunch over. That's not just because the character was old, it's also because he was hiding his money bag, that most of these pantalones had a hunchback. And she will, feign and swoop because he was a very powerful man. But this sort of improvised comedy is perfectly feasible. If they were trained actors, if they'd had any Commedia dell'arte training, they would have been able to improvise this. So this is the barcaruola a due voci, with Andy Wilkowski playing Dottore Dulcamara and Adina playing la Nina Gondoliera.
La Nina Gondoliera e il Senator Tridenti. Barcaruola a due voci, attenti!
Attenti!
Io sono ricco e tu sei bella, io ducati e vezzai tu, perché a me sarai tu bella, fino mia che vuoi di più.
Un senatore
Bravi! So there's your little introduction to the basis of Commedia dell'arte, and Donizetti actually gives you a little snippet of it, so you can see what's going on. So who is Dottore Dulcamara? Well, he's a combination of several characters. Now, one of them, Belcore, you can tell these names because they mean something. Good heart, Belcore, is a very simple Commedia dell'arte comedy. He's called Il Capitano, and that was an arrogant, pompous sergeant soldier who would be there and often employed by the Pantalone to prevent the innamorati getting together. But when he was employed, the sergeant would generally set the suitors in competition against each other and then try and woo the girl himself. And if there was actually a battle, he'd change sides and then say just how loyal he was. So he wasn't the most morally upstanding of sergeants. So Belcore is quite clear-cut. But Dulcamara is more difficult. He's a combination of several different characters. Obviously, he's a dottore, so he might be one of the vecchi, one of the older class. He's probably a little older than Adina. And the dottore was obviously over-educated and full of easy, complicated words, and you're about to see some of that. But Dottore Dulcamara, which comes from dolce and amara, sweet, bitter. Mr. Bittersweet is Dulcamara, that's what his name means, was probably one of the Zanni. Now, the Zanni were people like Harlequin, or the clown Piero, for example, and they were witty, intelligent, mischievous servants of this richer vecchi class. And they generally help the innamorati get together, which sort of is what Dulcamara was doing. And the Zanni is where we get our word zany, because these characters, like Figaro, were so sort of crazy and capricious. That's where the word zany comes from. So he's a combination of many different parts of Commedia dell'arte, which makes him such a colourful character. And he is the quack doctor par excellence. And he's selling his elixir of love, which we find out later is, of course, Bordeaux, or wine, just wine. And he is one of the best salesmen in the business. He's brilliant with language. He's perfected his sales pitch, and it's just like a Cialis commercial or something, you know? It cures diabetes, it cures the fashionable diseases of the liver, it cures anything you want. The only thing that's missing is the little side effects that say may cause nausea, shortness of breath, your leg falling off, or sudden death, you know? It's always done very quietly and quickly. So I'm going to give you one of the perhaps less familiar arias, but I'm going to give you a complete aria, and this is Dulcamara's entrance aria, Udite. And listen for the things that Andy does with his voice that keep the theatre in the voice. He might do some little abbellimenti, some little divisions. He may do a bit of a messa di voce. He may do little variations of dynamic or articulation. He may sing legato, he may sing staccato, you know? But it's all about the text. All of the theatre is in the voice because it's a bel canto aria, even though it's patter. It doesn't have to be slow and legato. So this is Andy, our beloved Andy, who's singing Dulcamara.
Io già suppongo e immagino che al par di me sappiate ch'io sono quel gran medico, dottore enciclopedico, chiamato Dulcamara, la cui virtù preclara ei porterà sono don tragico, mirabile liquore, dei pochi delle civici possente distruttore, i cui certificati autentici bollati toccarne le leggere a ciasche non farò. Per questo mio specifico, simpatico, prolifico, un buon settuagenario, e quale culinario, al mondo di 10 bamboli ancora diventò, di 10 o 20 bamboli fin non diventò. Per questo tutta sana, se breve settimana, più dura afflitta pena di piangere cessò. O voi matrone rigide, ringiovanir bramate, le vostre rughe incomode con esso cancellate. Volete voi donzelle bellisce aver la pelle, voi giovani galanti per sempre avere amanti, comprate il mio specifico, per poco ve lo do, per poco ve lo do, per poco ve lo do, da bravi giovinotti, da brave vedovete, comprate il mio specifico, per poco io ve lo do. E nuovi paralitici, spedici, gli apopletici, gli asmatici, gli asfitici, gli spiriti, i diabetici, quali scetti padini, estrofane, rachitidi, e fino ai manifesto che nuovo diventò. Mirabile per civici, mirabile per il fegato, quali scetti paralitici, spedici, gli apopletici, comprate il mio specifico, voi vedove donzelle, voi giovani galanti, per poco ve lo do. Avanti, avanti, o vedove, avanti, avanti, o bamboli, comprate il mio specifico, per poco ve lo do. Sì, sì, per poco ve lo do. Sì, sì, per poco ve lo do. Sì, sì, per poco io ve lo do. L'ho portato per la posta da lontano, mille miglia. Mi direte, quanto costa, quanto vale la bottiglia? 100 scudi? No! 30? No! 20? Nessuno si sgommenti per provare il mio contento, mi sia amico accoglimento, io si buona buona gente, uno sicuro regalare. Ecco qua, così stupendo, si balsamico Elixir, tutta Europa sa ch'io vendo niente men di 9 lire, ma siccome pur palese ch'io son nato nel paese, per 3 lire a voi lo cedo, sul 3 lire a voi richiedo. Così chiare come il sole, che a ciascuno che lo vuole, uno scudo bello e netto in saccoccia faccio entrare. Uno scudo bello e netto in saccoccia faccio entrare. Di patria il dolce affetto, gran miracolo gli può fare. Di patria il dolce affetto, gran miracolo gli può fare. Sì, sì, può fare. Sì, sì, può
Bravo. One of the great characters in opera and one of the great patter arias. But hopefully it was more than just a stream of words. All of the theatres in the voice, and that is what bel canto is. But the wonderful thing that sets Elixir of Love apart from other opera bouffers, like even The Barber of Seville, which is perhaps the greatest example of the genre, is that the characters, the central characters of Adina and Nemorino, are, because of this romanticism, they're just more fully fleshed out, real human characters. And Donizetti really tried to make that happen. This is based on a play called Le Filtre, which was set to music and actually turned into an opera by Aubert, who also wrote, a version of Manon Lescaut and various other things. But Donizetti really wanted it to be more romantic than that play. So he added Una furtiva lagrima himself, and he added 2 love duets. And we're going to close with one of my favorite love duets, and it's the very first that Adina and Nemorino sing. And you'll hear everything that I've been talking about in terms of bel canto and keeping the theatre in the voice. All of these nature references. She says, I'm like the breeze. You can't possibly pin me down to just one man. And he answers, but I'm like a river that has to go inexorably towards its source, i.e. Adina. And then she, in the cabaletta, she turns round and she sings, she mocks him by saying, I'm going to flit and bounce from one man to another. And her rhythm, you'll notice, is the same rhythm and the same arpeggios that Belcore, the sergeant, just sang. Bam, ba-dee, bidee, bidee, dee, 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 bum, ba-da, ba-dum, ba-da-dun, da-da-da-da-da. It's almost the same melody, because she's reminding him that she can have any man she wants, in particular, this sergeant. And the melodies are so great, but their relationship, the fact that they clearly fancy each other, is evident from the very beginning. So this is Chiedi a Laura, the glorious first love duet from the Elixir of Love. And this is Nicole Cabell and Nemorino Leonardo Cabalbo. I love it when they stage just like that.
sento, giorno e notte in ogni oggetto, d'obliarti fai io tento, il tuo viso sul tuo invento, col cambiar si vuol tu fai, può cambiar sogna il cor, ma non può giammai il primiero uscir dal tuo
Sì, sì, sì! Sì, sì, sì! Sì, sì! Mi dico!
And that's not even the famous bits, if there are any not famous bits in this opera. So one of the finest examples of opera buffa, an early romantic piece in the bel canto style, based on 200 years of tradition, rooted in commedia dell'arte, and what a gem it is. So we're going to take a little break, and then we're going to have a little discussion with our wonderful three principals here. Thank you very much. Okay, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. I have our Nicole Cabell, Leonardo Cabalbo, and Andy Wilkowski. I think we can give them a round of applause. And as usual, I like to keep these quite improvised, these little discussions, and I'd love you to be involved. So if there's something you want to ask specifically, we'll certainly open the floor to questions at the end, but feel free to ask questions as I sort of just give them some talking points. And why don't we start with Andy? Seeing as I've just been talking about all of the different types of commedia dell'arte, and you play both lyric and buffo roles, so different stock characters from the commedia dell'arte. You've actually played Belcore before, a lyric role, the sergeant, and now you're doing your first Dulcamara.
Yes.
They're very, very different styles of theatre. And of vocalizing as well. What are the challenges and what are you finding about the difference in the two?
Well, as you heard, the Dulcamara has got way more words than anybody else in the show. And that's probably the biggest difference between playing someone like Belcore and Dulcamara is that it's just twice as many words in the same amount of time. And what you were saying earlier about the theater being in the voice is very true in Belcore as well as Dulcamara, but the difference, I think, is that in my numbers, the melody is actually in the orchestra, not in my vocal part. As you heard, a lot of times I'm just singing one note over and over and over again. So the theater is in the delivery of the text more so than in the melody or the way the rhythm of, that the words are set, because they're usually just straight eighth notes. So it really you just have to bring life into all the text way more than you would in a more lyric role where you get to sing long legato phrases and pretty sounds.
Which do you prefer, Belcore or Dulcamara?
I mean, I think that Dulcamara is the most fun character in the show, and I mean, yeah, he's way more fun than Belcore. Definitely. I'm having a ball doing it. I'm having just a great time. So it would be hard to go back to Belcore after doing this, I think.
I love all of these characters. I'm just overjoyed. Belcore, in the last production I did in St. Louis, which was a wonderful production, there was an awful lot of this and then... So he sort of loved his own muscles. They both have their delights, they really do. And now let's move to, as we're talking about the characters, let's talk about Nemorino. And Nemorino has been a sort of a staple of the lyric tenor tradition for a long time. And I think, the most famous, my favorite is actually Carlo Bergonzi, who sang a fabulous Nemorino. But I think perhaps the most well-known is, of course, Pavarotti. And he really, it was iconic with Pavarotti. It really he was that Italian farmhand, country, simple boy, and he didn't even have to act, I think, when he was being Nemorino. But it is, I mean, it's sort of, that can be scary when there's that sort of precedent on a role, and when you're standing up, I mean, it's a very heavy night in the theatre for the tenor. It's the amount of stamina that's required is quite, it's no mean feat. And then at the end of the aria, the night, you have to stand up and deliver one of the most famous arias there is. So how does it feel? What's going through your head as you're singing Una furtiva at the end of the night?
Don't mess it up. No. What does it feel like? To be very honest, it's such a beautiful character to play because I think that he is... I don't like to play him as a stupid person. I think that he's just not very well educated. He hasn't experienced that much in life other than his small town and the people that he knows. And so he has a routine about his life. And so for me, when I arrive to that moment in this piece where you get to sing Una furtiva, what do I feel? I like to very much immerse myself in the character. And so, for me, it's a sense of really wonderment and just not fully comprehending the situation, because for Nemorino at that time, he just simply cannot believe that this woman that he's been in love with for so long, for as long as he can possibly remember, actually loves him back. And to see that tear in her eye, to see that glimmer really of hope, and that it's not just his imagination anymore, it's not just his desire, it's real, is very special. So as a singer and as an actor, it's actually a very humbling moment, And if you think about the great singers before us, it's when I'm up there doing that, I certainly don't stop and think like, no, what would Pavarotti do here? Or, I don't do that. I love Pavarotti. I love Bergonzi. I love lots of singers of the past and that also are currently singing. But I don't think an audience comes to see someone try to give their impression of someone else. I think an audience comes to see an honest and thoughtful performance, and for you to express something with your own voice. So.
And you're not thinking about your mother at all when you sing that, is it?
No, I mean, I really do love my mom.
Very important. Yes, it's one of the pitfalls, as it says in the score, Nemorino, coltivatore, giovane, semplice. And people think, okay, farmhand, simple boy. But it's not simple the way you might think, the sort of slightly derogatory way. It just means sort of direct, maybe not educated, but honest and sincere, I think is a better sort of description. And Nicole, so if we move to Adina, she's a more difficult character, I think, to play on stage, because it's quite easy for this sort of, because she spends the whole time not admitting that she actually loves this guy. And, she's a different social status. She's a landowner, whereas he's just a farmhand. And he's been sort of in love with her for ages, and she just keeps pushing him aside and slightly teasing him. So you can come across mean or a little hard-spirited if you're not careful, and it's difficult to be so sympathetic and us to really warm to you. How do you play
exactly. I've done this several times, thinking this is one of the most thankless roles, sort of on I don't mean musically, but just sort of you're not on as much as a tenor. It really is a tenor show, I think, and. At the same time, the music requires everything of your voice, and it requires she's probably the only character who really goes through a change. So there's sort of challenges for the character as well, and the reason it can be thankless if you do play her pretty sort of cold and distant and witchy. For lack of a better word, throughout the majority of the evening up until the last minute. And we're not sort of taking that approach for this one, but I like, and we've been talking this for the last couple of weeks about how this is really just a rom-com, it's a romantic comedy. She really should be a little bit distant and a little bit cold, because we really do want to see that shift. And I guess, it can be interpreted several ways deep down inside. she has always loved him, but she's not necessarily in love with him until a particular moment in the opera. And it's, the typical moment where you run to the plane when they're about to take off and confess your love to him, right? It's that kind of, at the very end of the opera, she changes her mind and they live happily ever after, which, she's sort of it's the Taming of the Shrew, right? It's a little bit of a modern woman gets schooled by love. And depends on how you want to see it. And we're playing it in a slightly more unique way this time. And I'll leave that to be a surprise for you guys. Come to the opera and see it.
Taming of the Shrew with lots of booze involved. We've got to get him drunk. So we've talked a bit about the characters, and I was waffling on there at length about sort of what bel canto is and the way we use our voice. And, I talked about what it isn't and sort of some of the bad habits of singing, and I'm sure you get this everywhere, but I'm going to mention it anyway. One of Nicole's, I suppose, high points in her career was when she won the Cardiff Singer of the World competition, which is really rather impressive. We are indeed very privileged to have Nicole here, but that just doesn't happen. There's a little bit of training that goes in as well as your obvious natural talent. So the things that I was talking about, is that the way you were trained? Is that how it works these days?
Yeah, well, it's sort of a perfect storm, I think, for a lot of singers, whether or not they find what's right for them, the path that's right for them. I've had several teachers through the course of my life that have taught very different things. So I really haven't had sort of consistent training. I'm studying pedagogy. I've been vocal pedagogy, the science of teaching singing, for a while to sort of really know my instrument, because I probably speak for a lot more singers than would admit it, but I'm always searching for the best technique. And I guess it's a good thing that I never feel like I absolutely find it. A lot of famous people feel that way too, and they will never admit it. But I have inside knowledge that a lot of people feel that way. And so for me, I think the Cardiff competition was a perfect storm of the right kind of preparation for that situation. I trained in the things that I needed to train in to advance well in that competition. I had further training to really, after the competition, to really know how to have a career, to really be able to pace myself in roles and live this life. But at the time, it was what I needed, and I don't know, some people would debate the word luck. So whether or not, no. Well, I mean, luck for the competition, I like to say that there is an element of luck there, because certain people who are on the judging panel, you're lucky if they happen to have the aesthetic in their ear for your voice. So that's as far as luck will go. If you hit all the right notes, you're on pitch, and you're doing, you're as musical as you can be. I think I got a little lucky that year, as well as being really prepared, because a lot of the people on the judging panel happened to buy what I was selling. That's how I look at it.
Cialis again.
I was the Dulcamara in this case. So yes, it takes a lot of hard work, but it is, like I say, the perfect storm of all the situations coming together.
Well, I've seen the clips, and I don't think there was too much luck involved. We're very privileged to have you here, Nicole. Thank you. And we're very privileged as well to have this man here, because he's doing an extraordinarily difficult back-to-back for us. He's not only singing an effortless Nemorino, which is a role you know and love and have done many times, and it's evident in the way he sort of invests in the character and the ideas that he has in staging, but you're turning around and you're creating the role of Captain Ben Marco in our world premiere of The Manchurian Candidate. And we've been talking about sort of styles of singing, and I don't think I can think of two more contrasting types of singing than Nemorino and then Captain Ben Marco. So tell us a bit about sort of the way your preparation differs for the two roles, and what feels different about singing them. What's the challenge for you?
They are completely different. Obviously, as you so eloquently explained earlier, Nemorino is very much a bel canto character, and you can use a lot of the very classic bel canto techniques and ways of articulating with your voice that not only go very much with the style, but really help you characterize and really bring the character really to life in a very vivid way, and you do that all with your voice. And something like The Manchurian Candidate, the music is not written in this style at all. It's obviously a contemporary piece. It's the music has a much more, I'm going to say, a more jagged sense to it in terms of how it's written. You often have to sing much larger intervals, and as a result, you can't really sing it exactly in the way that you would sing any sort of a bel canto piece or a Verdian opera. I mean, because I do a lot of different types of opera. I'm not one of those tenors that only sings like 3 or 4 roles, which some people do, and bless them for being able to do that. I have always sung a lot of different composers. I would say I'm bel canto trained, and that's the aesthetic I like to go for, and I like to bring elements of that into a modern piece, let's say like a Manchurian Candidate. And so when I'm creating a character like that, of course I do try to employ certain things that I know how to do vocally into a piece like that. But for me, I think, you open up a score and you try to get a sense of who is this composer and what is this composer really trying to say, and how do they create a character. When you were talking about Belcore and the fact that Donizetti uses a particular type of rhythm to show that this is a military man, and he even further makes him cocky by, this sort of a thing. We have the same thing that you find in all composers. And so definitely in the Manchurian Candidate, there are certain thematic things that I right away notice, and I try to bring those things out. In terms of how I technically approach it, I try to approach everything in a sense with, for lack of a better way of saying it, a bel canto way, just for vocal efficiency. But I can't really employ the exact same thing. So maybe you need to take out vibrato in certain areas to really make that pitch very clear. Sometimes you do that even in a bel canto piece. We all do.
Vibrato was actually more of an ornament back in that period, certainly in sort of Handel's time, which is when bel canto started. Vibrato wasn't on all notes. It was used more as an ornament. It was only when we got to sort of Leoncavallo and Puccini that it was wobbling about all over. So it was good that stopped. But yes, bel canto is really, the basis of bel canto is really, it's just good singing. It's good theatre, all of the theatres contained in the voice. But it's very hard. Bel canto is very challenging because it's so exposed, with all of the theatre relying on you. I've done shows with people who perhaps aren't particularly good bel canto singers. And because the music's it's very simple, if there's no theatre happening in the voice, there's no theatre. There's just, whereas in the Manchurian Candidate, an awful lot of it is contained, the activity and the interest is in the orchestra. Which is what happened in the Romantic tradition. It's an information age piece, is where the Manchurian Candidate comes from, rather than the early Romantic period. So it's a different challenge, and a more complicated, probably more mathematical, and pitches are harder. But they're different challenges, very much. I mean, I'm sure it swings and roundabouts. For all its difficulties, it is rewarding bel canto, isn't it?
Oh, immensely. When you sing any sort of a bel canto piece, and you do it well, if you do, it's very rewarding to have. There's sort of, at least for me, I think that there's something very cathartic about singing something in this very pure, honest way. It really speaks not only to the listener, but very much so to the performer. There's something very very sort of naked and raw about daring to do something that's that precise in a way, or that you try to be. And if you do something that is a schloopy or a slide or something, it has to be for a specific reason. I would hope that moving forward to a piece like The Manchurian Candidate, that some of those same principles, even if it's a completely different style, and the music sounds very different, that in a way all of us can sit there and say, well, you know what, we can use that, have those same ideas in our head when we approach these roles, you know. If I'm singing a piece by Puccini, or I'm doing I was just doing a lot of sort of rare French music before I got here in some concerts, and yes, you sing differently because the word is different and because of the sound of the orchestra, and you know, a lot of it is really just listening and responding. So much, even in a bel canto piece, when I hear people that I'm singing with sing something a certain way and I have my phrase, it changes how I do that. And so I think if you want to do different types of music, whether you're playing or conducting or singing, you really just have to have an open mind and the discipline to pay attention to what is the music telling us.
Well, it's all the theatre's in the voice, all the characters in the voice, and there's no orchestra to get in the way. It's marvelous, bel canto. So talking about different styles of music, Andy, you were doing a particularly different style of music just before this. You had a little project which was a collaboration between Glimmerglass and was it Milwaukee? Milwaukee Opera Theatre, called Guns N' Rosencavalier, which employed some of your perhaps more rock-based skills. A jack of all trades here, not just lyric and buffa. So tell us about that, Andy.
Yeah, well, that sort of came about, I mean, as a kid, I was forced to take piano lessons, and I sang in the choir and everything, but when I started taking guitar lessons, I thought, oh, well, this is what I need to be doing with my life.
My first instrument also.
Yeah. And I thought, you know, I'm going to be Eddie Van Halen. That's going to be my job. But it turned out that he already had a job being Eddie Van Halen himself. So I went to my fallback, which was opera singer. And, but I sort of approached, I mean, you know, even as I went to music school, I mean, when I first learned Schubert songs, I think like, man, that sounds like Metallica to me. That's just a straight up Metallica song. And so I always sort of thought that way, and playing in a band definitely sort of informed how I approach everything, but musically. But so I always had this idea of it would be cool to just present rock songs on a recital. Why not? I mean, those are the songs we all listen to, and you know, I love art song, but why not present an art song gone bad, as I like to call it, and just present some rock songs, but you know, just present them as though you were going to do a classical recital with all your interpretive things that you would do in an art song recital, but you just happen to be presenting material by Madonna, Van Halen, Bruce Springsteen, and Alicia Keys, as well as Schubert, Fauré, Strauss, and so we mashed them all together and created this piece called Guns N' Rosencavalier, and it was a collaboration between me, Kelly Rourke, who has done lots of translations of opera librettos for St. Louis and Glimmerglass, English National Opera. She worked with Opera America for several years, and a composer named John Glover, who I met, all of whom I met at Glimmerglass Opera. And this whole thing kind of started because they have this night at Glimmerglass where it's called Wrong Rep Night. And you have to get up and sing something that's wrong. It can't be anything from your Fach or your, you know, voice type. It just has to, that's the only rule. And so I got up and I sang a medley of 1980s rock power ballads. And I accompanied myself at the piano and I sang it all operatically. And John and Kelly said, wow, that was pretty cool. And we got to talking about this idea of presenting a rock recital, and Milwaukee Opera Theatre was forthright enough to allow us to present it there, and we debuted there, and we've also done it at Glimmerglass Opera. We did it at Mill City Opera last summer here, and we're doing it at Five Boroughs Music Festival in New York in March. So
wow.
It's really fun.
We have a multi-talented bunch up here, I'm sure you'll agree. Actually, my mother was always convinced that I was going to be the next Jimmy Page. There's still time, Andy, there's still time. Absolutely. Well, I'd love for you to ask anything that you'd like to ask of our singers about their lives as opera singers, about this show, any questions you might have, anything at all. A very reticent bunch tonight. It's obviously the cold.
Yeah.
No? Yes, sir.
I was just wondering, you know, where are all of you from, and how did you get here to Minnesota Opera?
I grew up in Minnesota, in Wilmer, a few hours away from here, and I've been singing with the company this is, I think, my 17th year singing with the company. So I've had a long-standing relationship with them, and I live over in St. Paul now, and so, yeah.
He secretly runs the opera.
Yeah, yeah, right.
Just schedules operas that he can be in.
Exactly.
You know.
I grew up in New Jersey, and Dale asked me to come here. So.
Well, and stay for the entire winter, and you agreed. Cool. Nicole.
I'm actually from Southern California, so this weather, I don't know about it. I live in Chicago, and I'm honored to be here because I've always wanted to come to the Minnesota Opera. I've just always known that it was a great company, and so I said yes, of course, when they asked, which was about a year ago, I think. It's like, okay, January, I can do it. I've done it. I live in Chicago, so I'm used to that. So.
We have a real bel canto specialist conducting the piece, Leonardo Vordoni, as you can tell by the name. And he's all of these things I've been talking about, prosody, about word stress and sort of using the text. Obviously, it's his native language. But he's been, both myself with the chorus and he have been working towards really making that the goal. So I think it's a very exciting project, and I think it's going to be a wonderful Elixir. I've seen all of these guys doing fabulous work in the rehearsal room. So any more questions, or should we get home in the cold? No? Oh, yes, one more. Here we are. Please.
Do you learn Italian or French or German separately? Do you take language lessons, or do you learn it as you learn performances?
Anyone? Go for it.
Okay. I think most of us went to a music school or conservatory. I would say most opera singers would go to a conservatory where, in my case, I took a year of Italian grammar and then a year of Italian diction. And then through my studies, I've traveled to Italy and been able to sort of use the language a little bit. I'm not as fluent as I'd like to be. So that's like an ongoing thing. And sort of depends on the language. Some people are fluent in Italian, some in French or German, more than others. And we just we learn how to pronounce it well enough so that people think we know how to speak it. We know what every word means, for sure. So
I think the most important thing is not obviously just good diction, but it's understanding how the language fits together. What's the verb? What the grammar of the sentence is, otherwise you're stuck, So there's got to be some level of something more than mechanical. There's got to be some sort of inherent understanding, especially for this sort of music. I don't think it's possible to sing an aria like that if you just don't understand how the language functions. Right. It can't happen, correct?
It just becomes a series of syllables, which is next to
Not too many.
to learn. You can't learn it unless there's some meaning in it. Right? You can learn it if there's not, you don't have some meaning attached to it. You just can't do it.
Yeah.
So have you each had language classes?
Yes.
As well?
I've had a lot in
You're
in
speak Italian fluently.
I grew up speaking Italian. My parents are both from Italy, so I grew up speaking Italian and spending a lot of time going back and forth between the U.S. and Italy. Through the years, of course, with schooling, like Nicole was saying, studied like German and French and Spanish, and I've performed opera in a lot of operas in French and in some in Spanish as well, and in German. So I've picked up the languages also by spending time there, as she was saying. So.
No problem. Good question. Okay. Well, thank you very, very much for coming. Thank you to my three compatriots. And we'll see you at the show. Thank you, guys. Thank you.